Boa tarde a todos. Nós, como coordenador do SECOMU deste ano, queremos dar as boas-vindas e dizer, quer dizer, relembrar o que é o SECOMU. O SECOMU é um evento satélite do Congresso da Sociedade Brasileira de Computação. O objetivo do SECOMU é reunir a comunidade acadêmica, principalmente da computação no Brasil, para discutir temas de interesse nacional. Neste ano, como o tema principal do Congresso é inovação e transformação digital, enfrentando a complexidade e as incertezas do mundo contemporâneo, escolhemos como temas para os 3 painéis o tema da privacidade de dados, da indústria 4.0 e da educação presencial e online. Hoje, às 14 horas, está começando o primeiro painel, né? E daqui a pouco nós vamos repassar para a moderadora iniciar esse painel. Amanhã vai ser o painel sobre, no mesmo horário, o painel sobre a indústria 4.0 e depois amanhã, no mesmo horário ainda, vai ser o painel sobre ensino presencial e ensino online. Agradeço a todos. Tem Roberto, se quiser complementar.
Eu quero informar também que a gente tem um canal específico para tradução online, então todo o painel vai ser traduzido para o português, né? Basta acessar ali o site do evento e procurar o canal adequado para assistir a apresentação em português. Basicamente é isso.
Então, passamos a palavra agora para Michela, Michela Nogueira, que é a moderadora desse painel. Esse painel vai ser em inglês. Hein?
Thank you, Jean-Marie. Thank you, Roberto. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a very great pleasure to moderate this panel as part of this 51st edition of the Seminário de Computação na Universidade, SECOMU. As Jean-Marie already told, SECOMU is one of the most important events inside the Brazilian Computer Society Congress. And I'm very happy to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation from moderating this panel. I will share my screen. I will very briefly introduce and invite you to reflect a little bit about the topic of this panel. Just a minute. So this panel will talk about the privacy, the data privacy, and the comportamental control that we have. I will come back to this slide and introduce the panelists just in a few minutes. But before going to that, I would like to invite you to reflect a little bit what is going on and the transformation, the digital transformation that we are observing in our society. So just to recap a little bit, on the middle of 90s, we had this Internet of places, let's say, where we have the desktops and fixed computers that we could communicate, but they were fixed, and we have some difficulties in terms of evolving the applications that we had. So in the evolution of that, in the middle of 2000, we could start to talk or call the internet of people, where we have a greater relation between the devices and the individuals itself. And evolving that, we have the notion of Internet of Things, where the devices get really starting to be ubiquitous and more integrated to our society and our devices. And this leads us for in the tendency in the future to come up with a greater integration of those devices and the systems or the human body, and the integration of these digital systems inside our society. So this brings us for a series of applications regarding to smart homes, smart cities, industrial automation, and mobile banking, etc. So we are in this context, and this extensive range of information and online services have or make available a different kind of data that has been collected. So whenever electronic devices are used, social networks are accessed, and chat are being used, users leave traces of their lives, sharing data, ideas, experience, habits, opinions, and feelings. In addition to this, electronic devices, IoT sensors, and face recognition, as I put there, cameras, have also become collectors of personal information. The extraction and the processing by AI, artificial intelligence, of all this personal data in great quantity and variety allow defining user profiles that can be sold to companies, governments, political parties, which can use them to influence the individual's behavior as a consumer or as a citizen, to control and to modify human behavior and on a large scale. Using this data, some large companies of technological sector, especially Google and Facebook, made the transformation of the digital economy into an economy of surveillance and behavioral control. As their business model, this can be very scary. In a reactive way, several initiatives by governments, regulatory bodies, and even technology companies have contributed to the definition of roles, laws, and tools that can greater protection of personal data and the non-use of this in a discriminatory or harmful way to the citizen and the community. Will this resistance be enough to counterbalance this new power that is transforming human nature in the name of corporate or political interests? This panel will discuss the privacy and the security of individuals in the information age, behavioral control, and alternatives for protecting data and controlling its use. So in this context of hyper-connected world, I'm very pleased to call or to moderate this panel and to call here as panelists Christine Hoppers, Miriam Wimmer, and Kay Henenberg to discuss with us these questions and bring a little bit or shade a little bit the light in this topic to our society. So we will start having the perspectives of the panelists. We will start with Christine, and then we'll pass to Miriam and then Kay. And after we'll have the questions and answers section, and then we'll conclude this panel. So I'm very pleased to call here Christine. And Christine is General Manager at CERT.br, the Brazilian national CERT, where she has been working on incident management at CERT.br since 1999. Christine is also an instructor of the incident handling courses at CERT division at Carnegie Mellon University. And an instructor at the School on Interest Governance and in Brazil. from CGIBR. So she was a member of the first board of directors and the coordination of the Best Practices Forum, SPAN and CSIRTS of the United Nations Internet Governance Forum. In 2020, she received the Mary Litinsky Award from M3AAWD, the world's largest organization fighting online abuse, for her work to increase the resilience of the internet. She was a moderator and a speaker at several national and international events, include OAS, UN, ITU, NIC, etc. So she's covering topics on incident management, privacy, implementations of CSIRTS, internet fraud, spam, and honeypots. So Christine, it's my pleasure. Please go to your talk.
Thank you very much, Michele. I think it's a pleasure to be here in this panel and to talk about a topic that I think it's a very hot topic for the past few years, not only this year, but I think it's really something we need to talk about. And I think everyone, when is speaking, has a bias. So I would start saying, as you said, I've been working at CERT.br for 22 years. So my bias is that really, as I'm working with incidents and working with what goes wrong on a daily basis, I cannot think at this issue of surveillance and lack of privacy without thinking also about security and about the implications of lack of security. And as you said, the importance of data protection and so many other issues that are involved in this topic. So I would like to start a little bit talking about what exactly is surveillance capitalism or surveillance economy. And I think it's very interesting to see that I think the most formal definition, it's really that is to use personal data as a commodity. So we kind of can make profit and use data from personal data. And I think it's very important to think about this, that it's really personal data that is this entity we are talking about here, and we are going to come back to personal data other times. But I think that usually we think about companies, but we need to think that governments are also doing a lot of surveillance, and they could profit from other perspectives. And I think this is something that's happening for the past 20 years. So governments were late users of internet in the past 20 years or so, but really they started to think about how to use the internet to collect data and to use it for intelligence or for other issues. And I think this also has to be in the back of our minds when we think about privacy and about behavior control. So I think the other part of the panel title that's very interesting is lack of privacy and behavioral control. So how do we get there from commoditizing personal data to lack of privacy and behavior control? So in the left side of this slide, I kind of say that, okay, that there's something by design that usually is what people think. They think about companies that actually are collecting data and they use it for intelligence and for really deriving from behavior and from data itself something from your data. So they could sell you something, they could provide services better, they can do something with it. Not necessarily bad, but really this is how we kind of start losing privacy, because this data starts to be amassed at places. And we need to think that once you have a lot of data concentrated in a place, you also have a lot of people interested in attacking that data, in getting access to that data. And we have the public sector that is using and it's collecting data to implement public policies. And there's good motivations and bad motivations, and I'm not going to talk about motivations, but countries, they need data to inform public policies on safety and health. They need to understand and to use that for human rights, to use that to combat terrorism. But then you also go for something like censorship and countries using that for citizen control. But you can also use that data for economy, to giving advantage to your industries to other countries. So there is a lot of data that can be used by governments, and that could be collected legally or not so legally, as we saw in the past years or so with all the Snowden cases and things that came up in the media. But one thing that I think most people don't realize is the right side, that because of carelessness, because of ignorance on understanding how technology works, ignorance on realizing how attackers think, or just incompetence, you have people that are not prepared to do what they're doing. We start having this massive amounts of devices, especially now in IoT and SCADA and medical systems, and poorly designed, poorly implemented systems that just exposed all our data to everyone. So it's not the company that collected anymore, it's not the government that collected that anymore, it's the foreign government, it's organized crime. So, and usually the reasons for these poorly designed, implemented systems, that they go navigate around naive assumptions. It's just amazing how when we are talking with people that developed a system that was compromised or they had a problem, I never thought about that, or I never assumed that could happen. I never thought that an attack would roll out like this. So usually that means that there was no risk analysis. There was no one actually looking at, okay, who can abuse this? What are the motives for people abusing the system? So what people can do if they have access to this? So is this way of protecting it good or bad? So usually developers, they just think in the lines, I'm using a password, and actually now that I have a password and I'm using cryptography, everything is okay. And that couldn't be farthest from I think the truth. So what we are seeing nowadays is that most systems, they really lack a security life cycle. And I think this is really true with medical, SCADA, and IoT. This is the worst of the worst. It's really, there is no thinking about patches, no thinking about really updating and upgrading. Usually authentication is just passwords when it is, and this is just open for attacks. And I think another point that we need to think about is that when we think about lack of privacy, privacy is a very difficult concept to define. So this is why you see that most countries, they have data protection laws and they have data protection authorities, and they think about how to protect personal data, because it's really fuzzy what privacy means. It usually means that I want to protect personal information, my private space, but every country is different and it's very tied to culture. But one thing and I think it's important to realize, is that you need the concepts of confidentiality and secrecy to be able to protect data. So usually confidentiality is the obligation of people that develop systems or that maintain systems to protect secrets if they know them. And the secrecy itself, it's using mechanisms to limit the number of people that can have access to that information. And this goes to, I think, the main point, that we need good security engineering to have good data protection, and for them to be able to have at least a little bit of privacy. And if you go to security engineering, the definition is about building systems to remain dependable. And then you see that's not only error or security, so it's really something that can happen. So it's really to be dependable in face of anything. And you can see that we need 4 things that are very important. One is policy. This is where laws come. This is where all the regulation is very important. We need mechanisms. This is where the academia, where the universities usually work more. That's really how to develop access controls, how to have hardware that not be tampered with, how to assemble systems that actually can implement the policies that were set up, using crypto, using other kind of technologies. You need assurance. to be able to know if it really is working or not. But I think one aspect that's very usually forgotten is incentive, because there are two types of incentives. You need to have incentive for people to do the right thing, to do the job properly, to make the system the best possible. And you need to understand the incentives of the attackers. So what are the motivations of the attackers to try to defeat the policy? And usually we see a lack of incentive to have better developed systems, and we have people not understanding the motives of the attackers and what they would do to get access to the information. So I think this is one aspect that people forget a lot. And then we start having things like this. This is a presentation. It's a paper that was published on the British Medical Journal. It's very interesting because it's a medical journal. They analyzed more than 20,000 mobile apps, looking to see what kind of sensitive information health, medical apps in general would collect. And I think it's kind of, here I see a lot of things that I don't understand why this would be collected. Most of them, probably it's lack of policies. And a lot of this is just because probably the developers are using frameworks that are collecting all this information anyway, and they have no idea they are collecting. Because you have medical and health apps that are collecting MAC addresses from the device. They are collecting the serial identifier from the SIM card. They are collecting the mobile carrier. They're collecting the location of the cell tower. Aside from apps that actually, for example, fitness apps that would try to see your location and map if you're running or doing something, not all maps, but we will see a lot of apps collecting this kind of information. And a lot of apps using things like Google Analytics and other kind of frameworks. And this is kind of, I don't know if the users know this is being collected because they were thinking about a health app. Another easy thing for people to think is, okay, but the apps will be secured. These are health apps. Yeah, this was not a study about security of the apps, but there was a study about security of financial apps. And here the incentive is aligned. So usually a financial organization, a bank or a fintech or something, they don't want people to commit fraud, and they want to protect data because they have a very specific incentive that they don't want people actually stealing money. And even then, we can see that the majority of apps have at least one high severity vulnerability. More than 80% leak data, and almost half of them are vulnerable to key encryption extraction. So, and this is another point I want to make. It's very hard to implement cryptography right. And most of developers, they're just using frameworks, having no idea if they're doing the right thing. And we see over and over and over this happening in apps and happening in IoT, in all systems. So it's really not just a point of I'm using cryptography. We really would need to have people learning how to use it right and really understanding this kind of motivations. So if you go to IoT, I didn't even bring any other examples because I think security cameras being hacked and used in attacks just became just the vanilla thing happening out there. But we need to think that this, I think, is the quintessential lack of privacy, because we have websites that are 24/7 broadcasting all security cameras and baby monitors and everything else on the internet. And this is all lack of good development and lack of security in the development phase. And there's nothing we can do later on to protect. So some of them are just problems in the cloud. That's the story, because every time you have an IoT, you have a cloud app on the back, and to really make access to the internet, so that there is a lot of things involved. And most of people think, oh, but hacking, it's very advanced and people need very advanced tools to hack. And I think this is one of my favorite articles, because they say that you weren't hacked because you lacked space-age network defenses. And this is the reality we see every day. We see here with incidents reported to CERT.br or any other instance with Yield, basically is this. It's because you're lacking patches, or because you have weak passwords, or you have policies that protect very important information with password only. And this is a report from a company that their day job is pen testing organizations. And you go that all these colors here is brute forcing of credentials, doesn't matter what. And even the 77% here, that is web applications, 68% is brute forcing credentials. And I think this is really complicated because people say, oh, but why don't you use a firewall or a web application firewall? That doesn't matter, because if your application is facing the internet, all those defenses, they will be bypassed by design, because you need to be accessed through the internet. So you need your application to be really strong and really built with care. And we have, like this year, the whole Colonial pipeline was brought offline because of one VPN password that was breached, and it was being sold on the black market, and someone got a hold of this password and they just had ransomware and everything else. So it doesn't matter if you are a security camera, if you're working with in critical infrastructure, or if you're working with anything else. So the problems are the same. They're permeated everywhere. And then we see these problems with medical equipment, and these medical equipments are not getting any better. We are not getting, this is a kind of old cases from 2015, but we see these cases coming up every day. And this is just to illustrate that I cannot imagine that someone that's developing an infusion system, so this is really for you to infuse medications or morphine or something else in a patient, would think that's acceptable to have a system that has no authentication whatsoever, and that would have unencrypted communications, and that would accept doses, commands, firmware updates through the internet with no protection whatsoever. Since you could overdose a person. And we have at least one case, I could not find that article, but of a person that was in severe pain and Googled about their infusion system. And when they Googled, they discovered how to increase the dosage, and they almost died because of that. So it's not necessarily only malice. You need to think about how to protect that from misuse and from other things as well. And I think we had here in Brazil, one of the main examples last year of a developer doing something that probably he learned like that. He never thought that that would be a problem, to get all his source code and credentials on GitHub. And we had all the tests on COVID patients being leaked online because one employee that was doing data science on the data just uploaded to GitHub all the usernames and passwords. But then I think 2 months or a month later, we discovered that the website itself from the Ministry of Health had the username and password stored in the source code. So it was a base 64 in the HTML in the web page. And these are things that it's very difficult to have security tools that would prevent from this kind of thing. So really you needed these developers being all the way since the very first discipline in the university being thought that they need to have more care, that they cannot upload things on GitHub. And this is not an isolated case. So in 2020, we had people from Cisco. They went to GitHub and they found all those secrets in GitHub. They found more than 2,000 API keys, OAuth tokens, private key files, and more than 2,000 hard-coded username and password. So this is the usual behavior of developers. And this is putting everyone in jeopardy of losing privacy and having behavior control and having criminals and other governments and everyone having access to the information. And this is a 2021 report. So you can see here the Git Garden, they always they scrape GitHub all the time. So Brazil is the number 2 country with sensitive data being leaked in GitHub. And here's just some examples of major data breaches that were because developers uploaded things to GitHub, credentials and access keys, and all the Google keys, cloud keys. Nowadays you have messaging systems that need to work. You have all those kind of chatbots that work, and they all need to share the secrets, and it's all in the cloud. And usually through GitHub, it's all the source code, and even code that's not open, it's there. So it's really complicated. And I think this is a conference of security on universities. This is something that's very important for me to say, is that we need to, we, as I say, is the industry, the academia, all professors, all teachers of all disciplines. We need to stop teaching security as a separate discipline. And we have been talking to people that are now going through a university, and they still have their learning programming as I learned 25 years ago. So, and it's really, oh, you see security later on. At that time, not even that. So when I graduated in 96, I didn't see anything related to security at all at the university. Now people see, but it's at the last year as something that you can put later on, and you cannot. So I think it's very important to start teaching security, or at least the importance of security in every discipline, teaching that security is everyone's responsibility. If you really fail on your database, or if you fail on the system you're developing, you're going to fail the whole system later on. So teaching to build systems, thinking only about use cases is really a problem, because we also need to think about abuse cases. So you need to think that, yeah, your system needs to work and it needs to fulfill what it's being built for. But you also need to think, how could people abuse the system? What could go wrong? What people can do with data if they have access to this system, and the ways that people can do that. We need to stop thinking that someone can fix something later. This is very difficult. And especially, I think, universities all over the world are still building bad muscle memory, because when students are pressed for time, when programmers and developers, they go to the industry, they start working, and they have deadlines, they have their bosses asking them for deadlines and to do something quicker and cheaper, they will just revert to muscle memory. They will not try to improve something later on. So you need to create this security mindset and muscle memory as soon as possible. We need to teach how to use Git properly, how to use the tools and developing tools, and really to focus on permeating security in every discipline. And nowadays we see that, like, one of the major points is data science, because it's really where people are dealing with all this personal data that's being collected, software engineering and programming, and I think really teaching critical thinking and skepticism, like to think about, what is the system I'm developing? Is this a good thing? And then it goes for ethical. Brazilian Computer Society has a code of ethics. ACM, the Association for Computer Machinery, has a code of ethics. And these codes of ethics, they really call for developers to think about how society can be impacted, and how that could actually be a problem for the society. So my final thoughts would be that it's not because something can be done that it should be done. And one example that would call for you, I don't know if everyone saw, it was the whole machine learning talk from last week or so, that GitHub now has their own artificial intelligence to program for you. So you start putting a comment about what you want, and then it will fulfill a program for you, and you are done. And it will learn with bad program, that's the bad software that's already on GitHub, because they even say that, okay, we cannot guarantee that in GitHub the code is okay, that's secure, so use at your own risk. So we are creating things. So is this really good? So if we have so many code on GitHub that upload passwords and keys, and that is really creating a problem, we have an artificial intelligence that's just propagating all those bad behaviors and all those problems. So I think people should ask themselves, what could possibly go wrong when you create a system like this? And you need to assume that someone will try to abuse the technology you are creating. And in this economy of surveillance, I think this is even more important to think about. All the ways that people could really do something bad or misuse the data, or all the ways that data can be leaked and then you don't have control anymore. So I have a lot of additional references. I would point at these slides will be public in the CERT.br webpage. So we have an area of speeches there. Specifically, this presentation of Usenix security for data hemorrhage from 2017. It's really interesting about how data flows and all this technology affects civil liberties, and a lot of other presentations and discussions about this topic from more of a security perspective. So thank you so much, Michele, and I'm eager to really see what the other panelists have to share with us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Christine. Okay, now we go to our second panelist, Miriam Wimmer. Miriam is a director of the Brazilian Data Protection Authority, ANPD. She holds a PhD degree in communications and cultural policy from the Faculty of Communication of the University of Brasilia, and a master's degree in public law from the faculty from the State University of Rio de Janeiro. She took part in 1 year international division program of Waseda University in Tokyo between 2001 and 2002. She is a professional civil servant since 2007 and a certified information privacy professional Europe with experience in senior positions in different public organizations, such as the National Telecommunications Regulator, Anatel, the Ministry of Communications, and the Ministry of Science, Technology, Innovation, and Communication. She is a professor at the Law School of Instituto Brasiliense de Direito Público and guest lecturer on digital law and personal data protection at several other educational institutes. Miriam, please welcome. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Michelle. Thank you for your kind introduction. I'd also like to say thank you to Professor Jean-Marie and Professor Roberto Willi, who are the coordinators of this edition of SECOMU, which is in fact one of the most important events in our Brazilian calendar related to IT discussions and computing discussions. So I'm extremely honored to share this panel with you, Michelle, and also with Christine and Kai, and I very much look forward to the discussions after the initial thoughts have been presented. It's very interesting for me to take part in this discussion because, as you mentioned, Michelle, I have a legal background. I'm a lawyer. I have a master's degree in public law. And I've always, throughout my professional life, been in a position where I have been talking about technology to lawyers. My work has always been at the intersection of law and technology. And now I find myself in an interesting position because I am among computer scientists, and I would like to bring a bit of a legal perspective to this discussion on privacy, personal data protection, and the idea of a surveillance economy. In fact, I think that when we look at the concept of privacy, of personal data protection, I think it's important to keep in mind that these ideas, these legal fields have been developed as tools to promote informational self-determination and the protection of personal autonomy. And this is increasingly important as we move towards a data-driven society, a data-driven economy, and also a data-driven government. So just to begin, I'd like to spend a few minutes talking about the idea of surveillance economy or surveillance capitalism, as Christine also mentioned. And I think this is a concept that has been very much developed in legal thinking and in political science over the last years. And these discussions come in the context of digital transformation, which was something that Michelle also mentioned in her opening remarks. When we discuss digital transformation, especially in this moment where we are going through a pandemic and where this phenomenon is somehow accelerated, it happens more quickly than we were imagining. We are discussing, of course, an entire ecosystem of technologies such as cloud computing, 5G, Internet of Things, big data, analytics, artificial intelligence. And this ecosystem of technologies allows us to go through a structural change in how our economy works and how our government works and in how we interact with each other as a society. And I think a very important part of this digital transformation phenomena in the economic sector is, in fact, the increase of importance of these business models which are based on platforms, digital platforms which organize multi-sided markets, which connect users from different segments, for instance, passengers to drivers, guests to hosts, users of social media to advertisers. And I think it's very important for us to recognize also that these new business models are business models that are based essentially on the accumulation of personal data. And this is something we can see very easily, not only from our own experiences interacting with these platforms, with these new business models, but also when we look, for instance, at the most important mergers and acquisitions in our global economy over the last years. These are mergers and acquisitions that are essentially driven by data, by the intention of accumulating data, of having more data available for these different business models. Also, when we look at the most valuable companies globally, these are traditionally companies that have a platform model of business and that are essentially based on the treatment and sharing and use of personal data. And this is a phenomenon that we also can observe within government, as government also moves towards a platform. And as I was mentioning, it's important also for us to take into account the influence of the COVID-19 pandemic, because this has in fact increased the demands for data collection and data sharing globally, not only within the private sector, but also between the private sector and the government and within governmental bodies themselves. So having spoken a bit about this new phenomenon, this new era in which we are living, which some authors will call, in fact, an era of surveillance, a surveillance economy, surveillance capitalism, I think it's important also to take a moment and to look at the sort of legal reaction that has been developed over the past decades, and discuss a bit about the concepts of privacy and data protection rules, personal data protection rules. In fact, although this is a discussion that is fairly recent here in Brazil, as many of you know, we only had our personal data protection law approved in 2018, and our National Data Protection Authority was created only in 2020. But it is in fact not a new discussion. And if we look at the European continent, for instance, the first data protection laws are from the 1970s. I think the first country that had a national data protection law was in fact not a country, it was the German state of Hessen. And then afterwards we had France and Sweden and other countries following along the same track. And when we look at this first generation of data protection laws, it is in fact easy to realize that this was a very first response to the emergence of electronic data processing within government and also within large corporations. So the 70s was the decade where we began to see the popularization and the dissemination of personal computers. And in fact, as we look at the late 70s and early 80s, we begin to see also an effort of drawing up standards that would allow data to flow in a free manner while protecting certain individual rights. So already in 1980, we see the OECD, for instance, the Organization for Economic and Cooperation and Development, coming up with guidelines on privacy and cross-border data flows. Then in 1981, we had the first international treaty dealing with privacy and personal data protection. This was Convention 108 from the Council of Europe. And as we move forward, we begin seeing that these laws sort of change their nature. The very early laws were in fact aimed towards the idea of controlling technology and limiting who would be allowed to have these big databases. And as we move along the 80s, we begin to see a shift in the way that the laws approach this issue of personal data processing and you know, the increasing economic importance of personal data. And we begin to see the emergence of a series of rights for data subjects and also obligations for governments worldwide in order to protect these data. In the 1990s, we see another shift where we have the emergence of independent protection authorities, first as a European phenomenon, but then later on other countries followed the same trend. In 1995, we have, of course, the European Directive on Privacy and Personal Data Protection. And I think in general, it's fair to say that while these laws were not created because of technology, they were in fact deeply influenced by the technological developments that took place over these periods. And I think especially when we look at the current scenario, where technologies are increasingly widespread, increasingly available for big organizations, but also for small organizations, it's important to realize that these technologies bring about qualitative and quantitative changes in the possibilities of data processing and also in the sorts of risks that are entailed by these processing activities. And in particular, I'd like to pause and quickly speak a bit about big data, artificial intelligence, these new technologies that allow us to identify trends, identify correlations, and that sort of shift us away from this traditional idea of identifying causal relations and instead lead us to a scenario where we are able to identify statistical standards, statistical patterns that allow us not only to have a very complete image of who an individual is today, but also to predict his or her future behavior. And I think this is in fact perhaps the most challenging aspect of technology nowadays. And in this sense, I'd like to very slightly differ from Christine. Christine was mentioning the importance of the protection of secret or confidential information, but I would like to add that when we discuss personal data protection, we are no longer speaking only about the protection of information that is secret or confidential, but also of promoting an adequate flow of data, even data that is publicly available in a very digital society, which is the characteristic of our modern times. So I think that when we look at this historical development and when we look at these new trends and these new possibilities in terms of data processing, it's important also to realize that there is a reaction from the legal world. And we begin to see a trend of more and more countries adopting personal data protection laws and personal data protection institutions. I believe we currently have over 140 different countries in the world with data protection laws, and most of them have, in fact, created also independent data protection authorities in order to ensure the fulfillment of these new rights and these new principles that are created. And I think perhaps one of the pillars of contemporary data protection laws is in fact the idea of informational self-determination, which is a very legal manner of stating that individuals should have the right to decide what information about themselves should be communicated to others and under which circumstances. And this is in fact an idea that begins to arise in legal thinking in 1970, more or less. It was an idea that was also very strongly confirmed by legal decisions, for instance, of the German Federal Constitutional Court in 1983 in the lawsuit that concerned the inconstitutionality of the Census Act. And I think that when we look at this idea of informational self-determination, which is also present in our own general data protection law here in Brazil, I think that a natural consequence of the recognition of this right is also the understanding that there is no such thing as insignificant personal information. Any information related to an individual is somehow the manner in which his or her identity is expressed in the digital scenario, and thus it is important that this information, however irrelevant, however insignificant it may seem, is also the subject of protection by our legal frameworks. And in this sense, I'd like to very briefly touch upon some of the principles that have been created and have been, consensus has been reached about these principles over the past decades. And many of them are in fact enshrined not only in national data protection laws, but also in international instruments such as, for instance, the OECD principles. We have, for instance, the collection limitation principle. And this is a very powerful principle that states that there should be limits to the collection of personal data, and any such data should be obtained by lawful and fair means and, where appropriate, with the knowledge or consent of the data subject. So this is very important because it sort of is a reaction to what Christine was describing, which is a tendency of collecting more and more and more data, even when it is not necessary for a certain application or a certain service. And the collection limitation principle, in fact, states the opposite, that there should be limits. You should not collect data when it is not necessary to fulfill certain provisions or certain capabilities of the application or the service or the business model that is being offered. Another very important principle is the principle of purpose specification, and this is also present in our own legislation here in Brazil. Here we call it princípio da finalidade, and basically this principle states that the purposes for which personal data are collected should be specified, not later than at the time of the data collection, and subsequent uses of this data, secondary uses of this personal data, should be limited to the fulfillment of those original purposes or others that are not incompatible with the original purposes and that are clearly specified every time there is a change of purpose. So this is also a very important principle, especially when we look at technologies such as artificial intelligence, for instance, or big data analytics, because what this principle states is that it is not possible to reuse and recombine data without any sort of limitation, and that in fact it's important to take into account the expectations of the data subject as to the purposes for which his personal data was collected. And finally, I think it's also interesting to make reference to a series of rights, which we also see in many different international organizations and also in national data protection laws. These rights are many times referred to as the ARCO rights, the right to access, rectification, cancellation, and opposition as to certain types of processing of personal data. And these rights, I think, are present in many different personal data protection legislation, and they have been accompanied by the debate on the necessity or not of recognizing new fundamental rights. For example, the right to be forgotten. This is a very important discussion, a very important contemporary discussion. There have already, of course, been legal decisions on this aspect. In Europe, for instance, in Brazil, this discussion has not yet been resolved. But I think that the whole debate on the right to be forgotten is related to the idea that digital technologies somehow subvert the natural processes of remembering and forgetting. You know, because time, you know, in the natural world has the effect of softening our pain, of allowing us to move on, of leaving the past behind. And somehow technology alters this delicate balance. And as a society, we are unlearning how to forget. So this is, of course, a very complex discussion from the legal standpoint, because it involves also debates, for instance, on freedom of press, on collective history, but also on individual rights. And I think this is perhaps one of the reactions that we see in the legal field when we face this new phenomenon of a hyper-connected world where data is collected and created and processed about us, you know, and on our behalf the whole time. Another important right that has been recently discussed is the right to revision of automated decisions and also the right to an explanation. And this basically reflects the idea that individuals should not be subject to decisions that are taken by an entirely automated process, and that when this happens, they are entitled to an explanation as to the most important criteria that have oriented, that have guided such a decision, and that they are also entitled to a human revision. And this, of course, is also a very important discussion when we look at the increasing presence of autonomous systems, of decisions taken by artificial intelligence that is increasingly able to make inferences and identify statistical patterns that are not usually very clearly explainable. So this is also an important field of legal discussion nowadays. But I think perhaps in a more basic manner, when we discuss this whole idea of surveillance capitalism or surveillance economy, we see discussions currently on the right to be offline, on the right to sanctuary, as Shoshana Zuboff would state it, on the right to invisibility. And these ideas basically refer to concepts that are very dear to us historically, the idea that individuals should have a right to shelter within their own home, within their own four walls, the idea that individuals should be able to protect themselves from curious eyes, you know, from the constant surveillance from others. And of course, this is an idea that is constantly challenged by smart appliances, by connected devices, by social networks. And in fact, many authors would argue that perhaps it is no longer possible to speak of a right to be anonymous in the age of big data. And an important aspect of this discussion is, of course, that individuals voluntarily, willingly participate in this society of total transparency, where we are not only willing, but we are eager to share information on our personal lives the entire time through social media and through connected devices that surround us constantly. So I think, you know, as a closing remark, all these legal discussions, of course, have to find, you know, a counterpart. They have to find somehow correspondence also in the technical field. And I think Christine was very, her comments were very appropriate when she mentioned that it is important in universities to begin introducing these discussions, not only on security, but also on ethics and human rights, on privacy by design, the importance of building bridges between these two communities. Because in fact, many times as a person who navigates between different fields, I have the feeling that lawyers are taking part in one discussion and technical specialists are taking part in another discussion, and somehow these discussions are not yet completely joined up. They are not completely in sync, and this is, of course, very important. I think also it's super important, super necessary for us to discuss the ideas of accountability, of having a risk-based approach in the design of new technologies and the use of these new technologies in different contexts, be it in the private sector, be it within government itself. The idea that data controllers and data processors are responsible for taking measures that allow them to be accountable as to the uses that are made of the personal data that they collect and that they use. And this involves, of course, creating privacy managing programs, being prepared to show the effectiveness of these programs. And here again, the issue of incentives that was raised by Christine is, of course, also very, very important. And finally, I think that this discussion also requires us to take a good look, a deep look at the issue of oversight, of governance structures, and enforcement mechanisms. And as I mentioned earlier, in fact, when we consider that currently around 140 different countries have already adopted privacy and personal data protection laws, it's important to note that most of these countries have worked on the idea of creating independent personal data authorities. And this is a work in progress still here in Brazil, because our DPA was created only last year, last November, and we are still not yet fully independent. But when we think of the importance of privacy and personal data protection in an increasingly digital society, I think also it is relevant to have a good look at these authorities and the role they have to play, understanding also that they are not the only actor responsible for promoting this cultural shift. We have to also look, for instance, at antitrust bodies, at consumer protection bodies, and also at private mechanisms, co-regulatory or self-regulatory mechanisms that will enable us to move towards a society where, in fact, there is a more ethical use of data based on the recognition of a fundamental human right to privacy and to personal data protection. So I think I'd like to pause at this point. I hope I haven't gone too much over my 20 minutes, but I very much look forward to listening to Kai and then later on taking any questions. Thank you very much. Michelle, back to you.
Thank you so much, Miriam. It was very open mind, at least from our side, technological side. Now I would like to pass for our next speaker, panelist. But before going to that, I just remember you that you can make already your questions, so you can send me your questions, and after Kay, we will start a discussion and Q&A section. So now it's my pleasure to introduce Kay Rennenberg. Kay is a chair of mobile business and multilateral security at Goethe University Frankfurt since 2002. He was a visiting professor at National Institute for Informatics in Tokyo, Japan since 2012. He's a chair of CEPIS, Legal and Security Issues Special Interest Network since 2003. Since 2015, he is Vice President of IFIP, and he's also a governor of ISOC, IEC, JTC, Working Group 5, Identity identity management and privacy technologies. So he has a very, very big CV. I will skip a little bit some of the details, and I will just conclude to introduce him, saying that he's currently a coordinator of CyberSec for Europe, a pilot for the European Cybersecurity Competence Network in Europe, and he has different interests, including mobile and embedded systems and multilateral security in mobile business, transport systems, and industrial applications. So he has a very big experience and certification regarding to privacy. And please, Kay, the floor is yours.
Ok, boa tarde. Muito obrigado por esta honroso convite para este evento tão importante. And sorry, that's about everything that I can talk in Portuguese or Brazilian Portuguese. And you may have noticed already for the latter part, I needed heavy help from the internet. I wouldn't have been able to do it otherwise. Thankfully, Michelle hasn't put up all of my biases from my CV. I'm going to add a few things maybe that has also decided me to put in or moved me to put in what I put into this presentation, and that is something that hopefully you can see here now. For quite a bit of my career, I have been kind of a ping pong ball between technology and computer science, where I studied originally, and legal requirements and lawyers, because when I studied computer science in Germany, the first big census in 1983 was set out with computer support, and it led to a trial at the Constitutional Court, which ended up with what nowadays is called informational self-determination. So that is one of the things that Miriam mentioned. Actually, I'm coming from Hessen. Goethe University Frankfurt is in Hessen, so I was very proud to see that Miriam was mentioning that. But the third element in which I'm a ping pong ball is actually economics and business, which is a faculty that I'm also now partly a professor in, and all of the economic and business pressures that make it difficult to get privacy done. And in that framework, I'd like you to see this talk, and where I'm going to explain a few examples where we're trying to do what is the, let's say, better world that you find in the title of this panel. And I'm very thankful to Christine and to Miriam already to have me presented all of the difficult and complex issues. Actually, what you have got from them in 45 minutes in Frankfurt, usually for our students, we take at least 3 months to teach them, and you got it in a very compact and great fashion. So I can only can hopefully now relate to it and have a more relaxed talk by this. So I don't need to talk anymore about smart systems in our life and their effect on privacy, because Christine has done that already quite nicely with, for example, the banking apps that she has been referring to. But I'm going to tell a little bit about the follow-up from us, that we, especially some PhD students in my group, and us had the feeling what is important. That is what we say, assessing and appraising apps for privacy is important. And I hope from this picture you can see what I mean. And probably you have, and most of you have a smartphone, maybe several of them, and probably you have been confronted with one or the other app markets. And by the way, when you see me watching around forward and backwards, that is basically because I'm checking with our master Alison on whether I'm speaking too fast or whether it's okay for the translators. Let's see whether that is working out. So you have a smartphone user, you have an app market, you try to download an app. What is happening? You're searching for the app, or maybe your best friend has told you what to do with the app. You get a result with a list of matching apps, again, unless your best friend has already told you what to take. And they're somehow ordered by relevance. And we'll come back to what that means. And once we see the whole picture, you select an app. And usually, what do you make your decision on? Again, if it wasn't your best friend who told you, probably some ratings, feature description, and maybe the look and feel on how it looked on the app market. Maybe some some comments from other users. Then you download and install it. And it asks for permission requests. And unless you have all of the knowledge that Christine has, you probably accept, at least that's what most people are doing, accept without any examination or understanding, deeper understanding, you accept, and all the permission requests that the app wants, it gets. And you do that in a repeated fashion. And that's what you're doing. And unless you are better than let's say 95% of the people, you don't have much knowledge or don't check very much what your app is actually doing and during runtime. And they have weaknesses. Christine has pointed that out already for banking apps. And we have the feeling, indeed, what Christine is saying is something that needs to be improved. People need to get a better understanding on what our apps are doing and to choose better. And by that, maybe eventually we will get better apps in the end. So let's see what we could have, and we thought new trust elements need to be built into this app market relation. So it would be great, we thought, when a privacy-related behavior profile of apps is somehow also in the order when apps are presented to you. That could be also useful, again, when you're selecting them. When your installation an installation process is happening, maybe that should actually happen with the minimal data and processing profile. So basically, there should be an installation process that follows your privacy profile that you've chosen, and it shows you alternatives. The idea, click here, and otherwise you don't get the app, and all your friends will not talk to you anymore because you're not cool if you're a teenager. That is to be avoided. And in the end, of course, it would be nice actually to learn something about how the app is behaving and maybe even able to give feedback, ideally in an app market, and say, hey, this app has disappointed me because it's all leaking my data all of the time. So the idea that we said is, of course, there is already an app market that exists. There are some privacy policies. There's app behavior, but maybe something like a privacy score manager. And I'm describing this now on a very abstract way, only we can come later back to it. It should be useful. So then we could have a one-time privacy information about long-term app behavior, privacy scores we could have. The weight behavior can maybe influence the privacy score. And influenced by the privacy score can be things like rating, installation, notice. Maybe also trust-enhanced app discovery can happen and trust-enhanced app installation. So the whole app market would be a little bit more consumer-friendly. And I'll come back to that concept later because I think it's politically important. And last but not least, it would be nice to learn about the privacy policy, like what are the companies actually promising, and inform people about all of that. So what could we do? See, a few PhD projects went into this. And one that is probably closest to what you've already seen from Christine is what we called A3, Android App Behavior Analyzer. And we used it for Android because in Android we could program it. The Apple stuff was so closed shop that we couldn't do it there. And what is basically happening here, and you see that on the left screen under A, it is scanning how apps are working and what of permissions apps are delivering is you find here under B. So you see for some quite popular apps, some permissions are being used. And if you find that list as a user, you get this. If the user, you find this worrying, you can look deeper and see what kind of access has been happening here, and then more details can come here. This is, we'll come back later, it's good for computer science, from computer scientists for computer scientists. Still, it has made sometimes a press. Majid Hatamian is is a PhD student who drove this very much, and with some papers he also got into press, especially in Sweden, where we had some contact partners, research partners on this. Basically, because these apps are collecting much more than you would expect. For example, cameras and all kind of things are on when the app is not supposed to run. We had this in a bigger setting on, let's say, how should the app market look like? And I apologize and for the German here, but maybe some of you may remember, and that's another example, may remember that originally the flashlight or the torchlight in an Android app was not, in an Android phone, could only be switched on when you had specific apps for that. And now you have an app that is switching on a light. What kind of permissions would it need? Maybe none. But it is collecting, these apps were collecting location information. They were collecting all kinds of transfer information of data. All of these kind of things were happening, and all that to switch on a light. So, and that was an analysis that actually Gökhan Baal did. And you see the red lights here already. And that's actually what I wanted to show you. How do you inform users in an app store? That was the center of what Gökhan was doing, and consider the app user not to be a computer scientist or security expert or privacy expert like Christina or Miriam. And we tried out a few things with 5-dimensional vectors on describing features. And it turned out the users didn't really understand it. In the end, we ended up like a traffic model, red, yellow, and green, for how much privacy is respected. That was something that users were alluding to. That is basically similar in a supermarket when you buy food, whether it is and has good health for you or not. That is the so-called traffic light something. And again, we're talking to consumers here, of course. I mean, most of the people who install an app are consumers and not experts in computer science. A few other things we tried to maybe transfer with some symbols, and it kind of worked in the user trials. So, and for example, something like Spotify. I don't know how popular Spotify is in Brazil. In Germany, it is quite popular. You basically download music, and the point is, from the type of music that you download, people actually can quite well understand who you are. And to make that clearer to people, these kind of symbols and things were made up. So Spotify knows that your mail from your music taste. Also, it knows where you're going, other things that are happening. So again, this is just a spotlight on what we were trying to do and get users to understand what is happening. The user trials were not so bad, actually, with the simplified models that we had. Of course, the big story or the big responsibility for us as computer scientists is how do we put everything down to these smaller and more abstract descriptions and not mislead the users at that point in time, the lay people. So that's actually not trivial, and there's lots of more work to be done. We did one other thing also, and that was Welde and Rafael Tesfaye. You find them up here. Very proud to have received a demo award, and that was on analyzing privacy policies and analyzing privacy policies on the internet, and give people, again, you see the traffic light. By then we had learned that the traffic light is somehow working. On which type of topics is the privacy policy quite okay, like green, or well iffy, but one can take a look at it, or really a problem, and that you see in red here. And this analysis was then done. So we're basically trying to find more ways to inform people and try to transfer information to people. Now, what does it tell us? You see in green here where we've done something. You see in red where more work needs to be done. And of course, also what we've done doesn't claim to be perfect, but at least something was done. What are the challenges and recommendations? And eventually you will see they become challenges again. Conceptualizing privacy consequences. That, I think, is somehow working. Considering functionality in context of data access, so to people understand it. Here we have some ideas for that. Monitor and communicate relevant app behavior. That's actually, we're not alone in the world with this. Quite a few things are happening there. Monitor and communicate provider behavior. Like when you have a service, something is done, more needs to be done. Automating all of that, of course, that's what computer scientists like to do anyway. Now with app marketplaces, now we come to that was the technical recommendations. Now we come to what would be political and recommendations for the people who have the power to do something about it. And now it gets politically interesting, I would say. And we've presented this concept over a few years to several app market providers, including the big ones, of course. We also have discussed it in W3C, the World Wide Web Consortium standardization. Experts found it very nice and said, we need to do this. Have you seen much of that in the app markets? Probably not very much. We went to a major German telecom provider, actually Deutsche Telekom, one that was sponsoring our chair for some time. And they said, yes, we like this. We try to do something like that with an app to evaluate also apps for our customers. because in Germany, we are the provider who's serving all the telephone services to every grandmother. And when the grandmother has a smartphone and the smartphone does strange things, the grandmother comes to our shop and says, I bought this from you, and I want you to sort it out, and otherwise I'm happy with you, even if it's not your you haven't produced that smartphone. So the idea of telecom was to say, well, let's have an app that recommends 10 standard apps, and that are the ones that are reasonably good enough for my grandmother and for your grandmother, and they are safe and they should be working, and that reduces all of the complaints. What was happening to that app was that Apple decided, no, we don't want to have that app in our app store. We are the only ones who decide who's evaluating apps and evaluates apps. And similar reactions from Google also. That brings me to something that meanwhile is happening in the German government over some years, and the Ministry for Consumer Protection and actually justice and consumer protection at the moment are together. And they're trying to negotiate and say, hey, we need regulation for all of these app things. And what they found out pretty quickly is when you are one country and you negotiate with the big Silicon Valley hyperscalers, it's a difficult job. And so what they're doing actually, and maybe that's useful to be discussed, they're trying to get this on the agenda of the G20. You know, the big G20 meetings of countries, and to put it on the ruling, which is not trivial, because data protection, to put it on the G20 agenda, is a bigger diplomatic process. But that's actually what is needed, maybe in a political sense, to move to this better world that we've been talking about. Beyond all of the technology stuff that, of course, also is needed in the regulation, but the regulation very often is national. We see a bit of regional of it. And of course, apart from that, still app developers need to do better work. And we're trying to help that, and standard setters. And we're coming back to standard setters in a minute. So that was the one example, trying to come from technology, trying to produce things a bit better, and you end up in big policy and big politics relatively soon. The other thing starts from big politics, and the European Union has meanwhile picked up data protection regulation, and I think Miriam was it who mentioned it already, the general data protection regulation from the European Union. A good thing about that one is it exists in many, many languages, including English, Portuguese, and German. So you can read about it. It has a number of nice principles. I'm not going to talk about all of that. I think Miriam has done quite a few principles. But what I thought I should tell you here quickly is to give you a bit of background on the work in this directive and also the related standardization. So what you find here on the left side is a number of articles in the data protection regulation, and that are principles that some of them I think you've already seen, that you've seen in Miriam's talk. And principles, consent, so that people need to agree on something, access and data portability, data protection by design and by default, regulation for who's processing data. If there's a breach, people should be notified. Data protection impact assessment, codes of conduct, certification, and of course, definition of personal data. So for some of these things, actually there exist standards now. And I do know, and you don't need to remember all of these numbers, of course, but it may be useful to know that there is some collaborative work, and between technology people trying to write these standards to fulfill some of these principles, and in the end to get something going. And that is quite a bit of work. And of course, it's a constant in discussion between all of the interested parties, which is not only consumer representatives and data protection lawyers, but of course also representatives of the related companies and people. And actually, there's a bit of typo here. This is supposed to read ISO IEC and then JTC1 SC27 Working Group 5. I will deliver an updated version of the slides where this is typed properly. I apologize for that. Anyway, you see that this is a kind of linkage between what you have on the legal side in terms of principles and what on the technology side you can offer. One example I'd like to highlight quickly, and that is about consent and information, because it fits our example from the apps. So there is actually a standard now and guidelines for online privacy notices and consent. Probably you have quite often on the internet already clicked on a button which says, I accept the conditions of this website with regard to privacy, or I accept this and that, and this and that cookie also. And the question is, how often have you really read the privacy conditions? And very often that is, of course, because they were presented to you when in a hurry. So to make this presented in a more palpable fashion, and also maybe to organize the process to be fairer for you, that is the background of this ISO and IEC 29184 standard, relatively new, but giving some guidelines. We hope that these guidelines are being fulfilled. At least there was some industry interest. And the next step, of course, is when you give consent, how is it documented? And for that, at the moment, there is a technical specification being worked on consent record information structure. How would look things that you consent? Second example that I wanted to give, and for European legislation, and that is the one where the big political fight is happening at the moment, the e-privacy regulation. You may wonder, if we have a general data protection regulation, why do you need an e-privacy regulation? Well, the e-privacy regulation has a background and comes from originally the telecommunications protection regulation, and for protecting confidentiality and the constitutional right of secrecy of messages, all of that. Obviously, and telecommunications and the whole internet got broader. And a good thing is, while the old e-privacy directive that we currently have is only applying to telecom operators, the new regulation is going to apply to all of the electronic communication services, what some people say over-the-top services. So WhatsApp, Skype, Viber, Facebook Messenger, all of the big players. But of course, for that first, it actually needs to come into force. It's negotiated since 2017, and there's lots of work to be done. The next thing is, what is very important, and again, it's a major fight, guarantee privacy both for content and for the metadata of electronic communications. Some people say that actually metadata is, and like who is communicating with whom, is very often even more important than the content. And some simpler rules and cookies are also hoped for. You probably have seen that currently we have a cookie scenario where very often people are overloaded by what they should say on cookies, which is actually not the fault of the regulation in a way, but the fault of the people who build the websites to some degree, or the standard that was originally built for websites in terms of making websites only work when so much data is being stored. So maybe we need a different architecture for websites. But again, that is to be seen. At the moment, there will be some more pragmatic, simpler rules on cookies. If you're interested in the regulation, you find the link here. What does it all tell us? Summary and conclusions. And I'm a German professor. A German professor needs to give summary and conclusions. Otherwise, I'm losing my pension. So we see that all of the smartness is expanding, and we see all of these data flows. And I think Christine introduced already the surveillance capitalism. One of the buzzwords is data as a new oil. And that is may or may not be true, but if you think about early oil markets, then you need to see actually we need to be aware of what we're doing, because oil markets, at least the early ones, were rough and not nice and easy markets. So the capitalism on that one is obviously not easy to manage. We have a number of requirements for communications in general, but it's for apps and app markets as a specific example that we see here. We have, and we think it's important that users and researchers and also regulators, we must carefully observe these data flows and the processing, and consider which data are actually being processed and needed, and whether that's worth it. And international collaboration again is needed. I've mentioned the G20 initiatives that I hopefully will come through, and I also would like to advertise a few of the international things that we are working with. And IFIP actually is the International Federation of Information Processing. CSBC is a member of it. It is the kind of United Nations of the computer science organization, so from kind of a global balance. It has a number of summer schools and working groups in this area. If you're interested, let me know. CyberSec for Europe is paying the salary for some of my PhD students, so it's certainly better to be mentioned here. If you like to see some more discussions on privacy in Europe, for example, the NISA Annual Privacy Forum every year is a good example. And then last but not least, special thanks go to these 3 and meanwhile postdocs, actually 4 postdocs meanwhile, and that have done all of this work, and that made it possible for me to have a nice presentation. So with that, I think I'm through, and I hope I didn't overrun too much, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Kay. It was just on time. Okay, so now we go to questions and answers. We have few questions here that before going to these questions, I would like to raise a last point that I didn't see in your talks. Well, we talked about the laws, the rights, and also all this engineering of these softwares and hardwares. But of course, this is important. We need to raise an aspect of you have, or the companies are aware of collecting data. But there is another point that is when the people and the leakage is transparent, even for the companies and for the people. So I would like to hear about you, how, for Miriam, from the perspective of the law, how to deal with that, and for Christine and Kay, what do you think about as this leakage that is, I mean, we can collect the data, but even the companies doesn't know that they are leaking, the protocols are leaking data, the softwares are leaking data. So how to deal with that? Because, I mean, sometimes we even don't know that we are having that situation. So I would like to hear from you. You can choose who start, and I don't know, Christine or Miriam. Yeah, Miriam, go. You open the mic. Yeah.
I was going to suggest that Christine goes first, but whatever you think is best. Christine, would you like to take the lead?
I think this is part of my whole presentation point, is that most organizations, they are with some level of problems, and they are leaking data, or they are providing data for surveillance to other people without knowing about it. So I think this is very complex, because organizations tend to think that they are always fulfilling compliance requirements. So you go for technical compliance, so ISO compliance, or you have some other compliance, but these usually are band-aids, and you have like these huge organizations with very complex areas and people from different knowledge areas that don't necessarily understand each other. So, and I think it's very important for the people from the compliance and legal area to try to ask the right questions to the technical people, because they will tend to be very specific, and they will tend to be very not think about like legal interpretations, because we have seen a lot of things saying, oh, is this data, the question, for example, from the legal area, oh, is this data using TLS? And then they will say yes. And then later on, the people from legal area say, oh, all data is encrypted. And then the technical people say, no, you just ask if it's using TLS in transmission. It's not encrypted because of this and that, because you're not with data at rest and this and that. So we are seeing this aspect of people having this complex system to secure. But from the other side, I think more and more we have a problem with people reusing code. So we are seeing, for example, this year, what was the one of the major hacks in the starting of the year was the SolarWinds. This was state actors hacking each other, but what was really the problem behind it was some credential problems, and it was a problem with the supply chain, with a problem with using software that was using libraries, that was reusing software, that actually you kind of lose control of exactly what you're using in your organization. And these are the situations that are more complex than just saying that I'm leaking data and I don't know. But what I would say to organizations is you can use tools you can try to pen test your organization. So what is the number one on the cloud? You have a bucket and it's open, and then someone indexed. So you could have someone in your organization trying to go and see, is everything really closed? So it's a combination of good engineering, good code, having compliance, having your legal departments and other departments really getting together with the technical people and see, we need to do this. So how do we do it? But there is a semantic problem of different disciplines that sometimes mean the same thing and just don't understand each other. So I think it's more complex than just saying, you know, I'm leaking and I don't know. But that really, I think, is the major problem, because we are seeing now a lot of data leaks. And this is one problem. What do you do when your data is already out there? How do you protect data that it's already on the public domain, let's say? So see what other people think about it.
If I might just add to what Christine has said, in fact, we have been in very close discussions with CERT.br through Christine over the last month, because Brazil has in fact faced very important data breaches early this year. And I think an interesting point for us to reflect upon is that although these data breaches were stated as being huge leakages, they were in fact probably the result of several small breaches that happened throughout several years, 5 years or 7 years, and ended up resulting in huge databases which are now available in the dark web to be negotiated using, you know, bitcoins and so on. So I think that the issue you raised, Michelle, is very interesting, because when we look at our data protection law is very much focused on data breaches that are identified. So when a data breach is identified, there is an obligation to notify the data protection authority and also notify the data subject. But I think, and this will of course trigger administrative investigations, sometimes also criminal proceedings. But I think that the bigger issue is the point you're getting at, that many times these data breaches are not in fact incidents, but they are continuous leakages due to insufficient security or inadequate policies, or, you know, just basic internal procedures that are not appropriate, as Christine was saying. And in this sense, I think that also what our data protection legislation brings to the table is this idea of accountability, the idea that data controllers should be accountable for what they do with data, and also the idea of data minimization. So what our law says is you should not have more data than is necessary. You should eliminate data that is no longer necessary for the purposes which you informed to the data subject when the data was originally collected. And when we speak about accountability, we are speaking of technical and administrative measures, not only of legal measures. So I think that if you look at organizations and you wish to promote an environment where they are in fact accountable, this would require much deeper conversations between different units within the same organization in order to reach this common language, or these common findings as to where the root of the problem is, in fact, rather than approaching the issue simply as a checklist, you know, to be marked and the problem is solved, you know. So I think it's a very interesting point, and in fact, I think we have a lot of work still to do, especially here in Brazil, where this is an issue that is still fairly new, and we don't have a long-standing culture of personal data protection or even of information security.
Okay. May I
Yes,
add?
yes.
I think these principles are very nicely described. And what maybe I can add from the European side, where there is maybe a bit more history in this, is that quite a few of these principles existed for quite some time, and they were more or less respected by the respective players. And that has changed to some degree with the GDPR for one measure that I think is actually was quite effective. It was hard fought for in Brussels, and that was the degree of punishment payments and the degree of enforced payments if somebody is doing something wrong, and the pushing of the responsibility to the top management. So we had for a long time in Europe, we had data protection breaches, and maybe the penalty was 50,000 or 100,000 Deutschmarks or euros. Doesn't make a big difference for a big company. But meanwhile, with the GDPR, there is 2% and 4% of the revenue in the law as possible penalties. And what I noticed over the years is that indeed this has actually made top management become aware. So it looks like from whatever 1% or whatever of annual revenue, top management starts to become interested. And what you could see is that they were all installing more data protection people, data protection consultants were hired, more investment was made, because people were basically calculating the investment in relation to the penalties that they possibly would have to pay. And 2% of annual revenue is a figure that management starts to be interested in. So I think that was actually a smart move by the European Union to have these higher penalties in, and indeed some of them have been paid. And that doesn't mean that no unknown leakages would happen anymore, but I think it has to some degree changed the culture in terms of that investment is now happening into looking into things and to enabling the kind of discussions that Miriam has mentioned to be happen to implement some of the things that Christine has said need to be implemented, and to fully agree. So one must say money talks to some degree, and this kind of provision in CET seems to have something. I mean, it doesn't remove the fact that there is maybe a company that is bankrupt anyway and would do anything, but there's quite a few companies that are not bankrupt and they were still doing strange things, and that is at least now a bit better under control. But it still requires knowledge, and for example, deletion concepts. Again, that is actually a standard that was not in my list. There is a concept on when can you delete certain data, which is not as trivial. Data minimization is a great principle, but then when you're sitting in a company, on the one side, the tax office says you need to keep certain data for 10 years because otherwise you need to prove that you actually paid correct tax. You need to keep certain data for 6 years, maybe because of consumer protection, to show that you haven't messed up, but you should delete the data as soon as possible. So deleting data is not an easy thing. And again, it's good that we have an ISO standard now, an ISO IC standard on how to build your deletion concept and what to look at. And that's only one of the examples that I think are now, where there's now more investment is moving into this implementation of this. And actually, I honestly must admit, I don't know what exactly the powers of ANPD are and common provisions in the Brazilian law. But if you don't have that provision of being able to give out high penalties, and try to get it as soon as possible, because that indeed, we had 30 years with not much happening, and since we have that, quite a bit of progress happened.
Very good, Kay. And your example also lead us for Fernando's question. I think, in fact, Fernando has two questions. I think they are complementary, and I will put here. His question is regarding to the trade-off. So from one side, we have this sensing data and we need to protect. But in another side, in some cases, we need to audit this data. So in that case, how he puts from the law perspective, how the law will deal with this situation. But also, I think we can extend for the technological perspective, how to deal, as in the example of Kay, how to deal with the law in one side, and in the other side, how to, in his case, keep the data or not, and decide what to do from the technological perspective. So I left the floor open for who wants to start.
I'd be happy to jump in, Michele. I was in fact looking at Fernando's question, thinking it's really interesting because he touches also on the issue of autonomous vehicles, if I'm not mistaken, and AI liability, which is another rabbit hole we have to go down one day. But I think an important point that needs to be made is that data protection laws are not designed to prevent data from flowing, but to enable and to ensure an adequate flow of data. So I think it would be, in fact, closing, in Brazil we say, trying to cover the sun with a fishnet if we intended to prevent data from flowing. And this is in fact not the idea. Personal data protection legislation seeks to recognize the need for protection of personal data while also ensuring an adequate scenario, an adequate legal environment for this data to flow. And in this sense, the approach we have here in Brazil and also in Europe is an ex ante approach, which means that data can be processed when there is an appropriate legal basis for such. And this may be, for instance, consent or fulfillment of a contract or legal obligation or legitimate interest. There are a number of legal grounds which allow data to be accessed and to be processed lawfully. So I think also a point that he was making in his question is very interesting because he was mentioning property rights related to personal data. And I think it's important to note that here in Brazil and also in Europe, the legal protection that we give to personal data is not based on property rights, but on the idea of a fundamental right. And that is why we don't say a personal data protection owner, but a data subject. We don't say proprietário de dados in Portuguese, but titular de dados, because the idea is that no matter where this data is or who in fact owns the database, the data subject will always have certain rights regarding this data, such as the ARCO rights I mentioned earlier, and this data will always have to observe these principles that I also mentioned and that we see in documents of the OECD, of the European Commission, and in our own Brazilian general data protection legislation. So I think when we discuss liability and auditing, which is I think the issue he was bringing up, certainly it will be possible to have a legal basis that allows lawful access to this data. But in fact, I think there is still a great lack of clarity on the legal framework for autonomous vehicles and AI liability in general. And this is also associated to this discussion of black box systems, systems which are very opaque, systems which are not always explainable. So even if we were able to audit these systems many times, we would not be able to understand why a certain decision was made, and to clarify this and to identify who would be responsible for problems that might emerge. And in this sense, I think his question is also interesting because it raises a number of issues related to different approaches towards liability. When we have these black box systems, we have, for instance, strict liability, which says that no matter who is at fault, there will always be strict liability. Always there will be a duty to indemnify whoever was harmed by such a system. We have different approaches based on mandatory insurance schemes, for instance. So licensing requirements also. So I think this is another discussion which is very interesting and which is connected to personal data protection, but somehow also goes beyond our discussion here in this panel.
I would like to jump in just a little bit from the technical side, because I think log management and security of logs is a huge topic in security itself. And there are lots of best practices that you can follow that can minimize abuse and then minimize problem. And I think logs are always an issue, because it's been an issue with when we were discussing Marco Civil, they were an issue when discussing other stuff. And I think with data in general, one principle not only to minimize data, but to avoid creating huge databases with all data that you have. So I think nowadays that this is one thing that people should start thinking, okay, we have big data technologies. We have this whole concepts of data lakes. From a data protection perspective, not necessarily this is the best idea, because if you put in the same database, the logs, the accesses, the GPS, the biographical data and behavior data and logs of it, so you start creating really behavior that you would not have with logs by themselves or with the data separated. So I think not only a good design from the point of view of minimizing data collection, but also a good design from the point of view of not having that data so easily searchable and so easy for you to make assumptions and to derive data. And just for our last question point, I was thinking something, we have to choose about what to talk with our first points, but nowadays ransomware is a big problem also, not only data leaks, because more than 80% of all ransomware gangs, they are, the extortion, it's aimed at not leaking information. It's not about encrypting data anymore. So they encrypt and they will extort you saying that they're not leak. And lately the insurance companies, they are doing some researches, and we have at the Forum of Instant Response Teams, there is a special interest group with all the global reinsurers. So we were discussing, I know that group is discussing what would be really how the insurers will know that you are having the right incentives in place and that you have the right technologies. And there was some research saying that some companies now are thinking about paying up to 20% of their actual profits per year for extortion if they are actually victims of ransomware. So really the ransomware market, it's kind of changing the insurance market, and it's kind of changing what companies are willing to pay not to have a problem and have data leaked. And this is really a new discussion going on. So it's just for us to think that a good design of system, not only to minimize data, but also to make it more difficult to process data in a way that would actually, I think, be abusive or expose users to more than they should be exposed when you are collecting that data.
Okay, so maybe I'd like to add a few examples from this vehicle scenario, because actually we have been involved in a bit of discussion with the some car industry players and on this autonomous driving and privacy scenario. Actually, there's even a public open source book on that if there's interest in it. The first thing is actually if the vehicle is really autonomous, then the logging is actually much easier because there are not so many personal data of the passengers, because the passengers are only passengers. You just have to basically remove the location data, and there's nothing like misbehaving drivers who are speeding too fast. And of course, the interesting question is actually, or the difficult question is the kind of semi-autonomous car, which is somehow supported by computers and logged by computers, but there's still driving behavior, so personal data, personal behavior being logged, like how you drive your car basically before the accident happened. And the first thing is, turns out that there is actually a major fundamental decision to be made, or balancing to be made, in terms of, and do we want to be able to scrutinize and analyze every kind of thing that it goes wrong in all detail? And on the one side, on the other side, do we want to protect privacy of people to make sure that they're not totally surveyed? Because there are some solutions, but there is a fundamental contradiction, of course, to some degree. And also in other parts of real life, of course, we don't document everything just to be sure that we know everything if something went wrong. The idea of saying something may go wrong and we don't know what happened is actually a basis to some degree for having a free society. Otherwise, everything would be recorded. Now, the question is, of course, you want to record something because driving is inherently dangerous, and that's basically the approach of traffic lawyers. So you're driving something dangerous, you're doing something dangerous, so you need to be surveyed more. And the other point was very much so far to say, okay, and we may need to collect certain data on driving behavior, on what happened before the accident. But maybe this is actually not only given out to everybody, but only with whatever kind of appropriate encryption also to specific instances, and maybe only if at the same time a representative of the driver is also around and can see those data. So it's a kind of a refined access control that can happen. That, of course, is expensive, and it can be difficult, but may have to be difficult in implemented in hardware. And we may see some very not so easy architectures on all of that. But especially when it comes to driving safety and at the same time protection of behavior, we may see some very refined architectures, maybe at least in the next generation.
Thank you, Kay.
Thanks.
Because of the time, I would like to go for this next round for one question and do the round. And then I would like that we together build a conclusion of this panel. So if you can be brief for this next question, I appreciate it, because then we can go to the conclusion. So the next question is from Avelino. He says that technology is advancing at a very fast pace. I agree that we have to teach security earlier and better in our undergrad courses. However, how to speed up that also from our legislative and judiciary? I think it's for you, Miriam.
Okay, sure. I think it's a difficult question because there is really no clear answer. And as I was mentioning earlier, I think we are, in fact, at this point in time, going through this process of digital transformation. And it is, of course, a learning curve, a very steep learning curve. And here in Brazil, suddenly, because of the pandemic, everyone had to move to insecure networks, to home offices, and sort of do their best. And at the same time, we were facing huge data breaches. So I think this is sort of our growing pains. It is the period we are going through where everyone is learning about these new topics. And I think that, as Christine was also mentioning earlier, it is important for us to create these better interconnections between the legal field and the technical fields. So in law school, for instance, I graduated in 2003, I think. We didn't have any subjects related to technology. And in fact, when I graduated and I began working with telecommunications, my colleagues from law school were, why are you working with technology? Didn't you go to law school? What are you doing? And somehow I think the inverse is also true when you speak to people graduating from computer science universities or engineering, electronic engineering, and you wish to talk to them about law and ethics and human rights. Many times there is still a response that people are, why should I learn about this? What does this have to do with me? So I think the issue of building bridges between different communities is important, and this will also gradually have a greater effect also within the legislative and the judiciary branches. But it's a learning process, and this doesn't happen instantaneously, so I think we still have a long path to move forward on.
Yeah, I would like just to add to what Miriam said, that usually you hear people from the technical side saying that people from the legal side need to learn more about technology, but we need to learn more about legal areas. So for the past 20 years, I've been learning more about legal, studying, first understanding how it works, how our legal system works, who are the actors that can do something. Usually in the beginning, we are interested about crime and about forensics, and then later on, you try to understand a little bit more about other areas. So I think it's really try to, attend conferences in other areas. Try to bring people from the legal area to the universities to, give a presentation to the students on what are their challenges, to understand some technical terms. Don't assume the technical terms are easy, and especially there are some reserved words, that mean something to the legal people that means something else to the technical people. So I've been in panels where there are these crazy things happening when you use some words like monitoring, or when you use some words like a process, or when you use some words, and then you get all these people like looking at each other and kind of not understanding. So it's really, we as technical community need to reach more to understand a little bit better, and then maybe to be able to communicate better what we mean and what are the impacts of the technology, because we all get into this silo, and I have this difficulty sometimes when I go to a more legal panel, that I understand like half of what they're saying because I don't understand the terms, and I know that probably the same is the other way around, because we tend to specialize too much, and this happens inside computer science as a science, so that you have like the data science people talking stuff that people from artificial intelligence doesn't understand, that people from networking does not understand, and we are starting to create silos even inside our own technical area. So we really need to cross bridges to be able to tackle this problem.
Yes, I have a few examples on how this can be working and what needs to be done in future. I mean, one area obviously is standardization. So this working group 5 that I'm actually convening, that Michelle was mentioning, in standardization actually has probably 30% lawyers, 70% technology people. That's not a balance, but you have two languages at the table. And when you do things like privacy frameworks and to be understood by technologists, and they're interpreting things like GDPR or other privacy regulation, or OECD recommendations or Pacific recommendations on privacy, that is an interesting exercise. And it basically what is happening is what Christine is describing, but it's a very useful exercise. It needs to happen actually earlier. So we pushed for having such courses like even legal elements of, for example, data protection in computer science courses. And that is a bit of a push, but it seems to work. And the other way around also, I think it happens more. And one can, of course, sponsor in interdisciplinary research projects. For example, CyberSec for Europe actually is quite interdisciplinary with especially these disciplines, but also other ones. Something that I wanted to highlight, because maybe SBC can do something about it as the organizer of this conference, and of course, as an influential force in Brazil, I suppose. And what we noticed in Germany and Europe, but also elsewhere, is you have all of these nice projects. People are learning a lot, and meanwhile, actually, they have very good job market chances in industry, in consultancies and lawyers, wherever. These kind of dual qualification, really, people who know what's going on know that these people are valuable and they get salaries. But in the academic market, you're still seen as a kind of funny animal. So the core academic professorship and regulations, and I think that that's both for law and for computer science, very often say when you make a clean career in one of the subjects and you collect papers in one area of discipline, then you actually have a good chance for a career. If you're collecting papers in different disciplines, very often only half of your papers are counted. And I think that's something that needs to be overcome. It's a problem in Europe. I don't know how much it is a problem in Brazil, but definitely I wanted to raise it. If SBC can do something about it or has a solution already, I'm happy to hear about the solution. Otherwise, please do something about it, because we need to do that. I was lucky because I did two things in different areas, but I was making my career in a boom time when people were happy to get somebody as a professor. So it worked out with all of my different things. And of course, the more people are around, and the more people tend to choose clean careers, and I think that's not good. And we probably need to make more and more statements to say that that we need more than just clean career people in universities.
Thank you, Kay. Now I would like to invite you to build a conclusion of this panel together. I have raised or pointed here few aspects that I could that could bring my attention regarding to your talks. I will start, and then if you want to add anything that you think it's important to leave for the audience, please, I appreciate it if you can enjoy. So we have seen this digital transformation and how this is impacting our lives in terms of using these applications, these devices, and the collection of the data and the surveillance that the companies can benefit from the data that is leaking in an aware and unaware way from these devices. I took from what you said that education is important in terms of the integration or connection between law and technology, and also education in terms of interdisciplinary aspects from the beginning, from early times of these undergrad students, or maybe, I don't know, maybe earlier, as a cultural aspect in our society. So if you want to add something more in terms of concluding the panel.
I would like just to add a point that I saw someone making in one of the questions, that at the end, we have the owner of the data, we have the internet user, you have the citizen that wants to use something. And I think we all need to make sure that we communicate clearer among ourselves. This is a very interesting work from Carnegie Mellon University on trying to really communicate what are the implications of security and privacy and even some other stuff for the user, for them to actually look at it and try to understand what is the risk of using the technology. Because there are two problems: people overestimating the risk and underestimating the risk, and both are bad. And we are seeing nowadays a lot of people just overestimating the risk and stopping using some technologies. We see accounts of people that are not using banking apps anymore because they are afraid, because they heard on the news about this and that, and they are not using some technologies that could make their lives much better because they are overestimating the risks as well. So we need to be more clear in that aspect. We didn't have time to talk about it, but I think this is very important for all the companies and everyone as well.
Thank you, Michelle. I think you had a very great summary of our discussions. I think I'd like to highlight and add to the issue that was raised on the need for cross-disciplinary research, and to say that also when we discuss our regulatory approaches, our governance structures, it is also important for us to have the involvement of different public authorities, for instance, antitrust bodies, consumer protection bodies, data protection bodies, and also to explore different regulatory strategies, not only based on command and control, but also based on more co-regulatory approaches, which also places emphasis on the role of private actors in creating these necessary conditions for data to be handled responsibly and ethically. So I think those would be my closing thoughts. I'd like to say thank you once more for the kind invitation to take part in this panel. It was lovely discussing with you, Michelle, with Kai, with Christine, and I hope we have other opportunities in the future. Thank you.
Okay, so I don't think I have any chance to live up to that degree of charms that Miriam has already expressed now. So I just come up with two comments maybe, and following on maybe from what Christine has and has set on the usage and non-usage of new technologies. I think there's two elements that can also be success factors. One element is, are people being forced to use a new technology, or do they have a choice? And very often now we see that, and not necessarily banking apps, but Corona apps, we've seen it in some areas, either use the app or you're out. And that is certainly not creating trust. So there should be opportunities and choices for people. We've seen that in the telecommunication markets, at least in Germany, in the 80s, when there was one player and they were saying how things were going, people were complaining. Once they had a choice, they were actually making the decisions and balancing things. And so giving people a choice can actually lead to more technology and acceptance, even though then people may be able to use other things. For example, removing cash money now and pushing people to electronic money, I think is the worst that you can do, and to electronic money at the same time. The other thing I think is important, and that's for all the bean counters, if you introduce a new technology in computer science or computer science-based technology, and you say, we now at the same time want to save a lot of money while we're introducing this technology, this is almost asking for disaster. A new technology should give better options, more functionality, and should have time to mature. And once you've done that, you can start about saving money. But if you just introduce it to save money in the first place, usually you're cutting so many corners that something will go wrong and people will lose trust. And so these are two very, I think, important aspects if you want to get an innovation that is sustainable. That's not as polite and as nice and as charming as what Miriam said, but I thought it's still important.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Kay, Amelia, Christine, for your participation in this panel. I think I'm sorry we didn't have time to go for all the questions, but I believe that we passed the complexity of this topic for the audience, and for sure is some topic to be continued. Discussion must be continued in the future. So thank you so much, and thank you for the audience. And I just remind that tomorrow we have another panel, and stay tuned for the panel too. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot.
Já imaginou se você não tivesse seu direito à liberdade de expressão respeitado? Se seus dados particulares fossem divulgados sem autorização? Ou se você tivesse sua navegação filtrada por causa de interesses comerciais? A liberdade de expressão, a privacidade e a neutralidade da rede são fundamentais para a internet. E esses são apenas alguns dos 10 princípios formulados pelo Comitê Gestor da Internet no Brasil. O CGI.br promove há mais de 20 anos a internet no país. Graças a ele, você tem constante inovação, segurança e diretrizes para o desenvolvimento da internet. Isso tudo é feito de forma colaborativa, transparente e democrática. O comitê é formado por representantes de todos os setores da sociedade. Assim, as decisões são tomadas por meio do diálogo, com a participação de todos os membros até que um consenso seja alcançado. Por esses e outros fatores, o modelo brasileiro de governança se tornou referência no mundo todo. CGI.br, por uma internet cada vez melhor no Brasil.
Apesar do acesso à informação no Brasil ser um direito e gratuito, nem sempre foi uma realidade. No início da migração para o digital, o caminho até a informação jurídica não era tão simples. Para talvez encontrar uma jurisprudência ideal, por exemplo, era necessário percorrer os mais de 70 sites de tribunais com diferentes funcionalidades e dificuldades. Para uma justiça mais efetiva e mais próxima dos cidadãos, era preciso um pouco de transformação. Então, um grupo de jovens curiosos e com muito desejo de arriscar decidiu resolver esse problema através da tecnologia. Foi assim que surgiu o Jus Brasil, com uma missão: transformar o acesso à informação jurídica, agregando mais rapidez, mais praticidade e muito mais acessibilidade. Investimos em tecnologia de ponta e nas melhores práticas de design para perseguir incansavelmente a melhor experiência para os nossos usuários. A cada dia expandimos o alcance e aumentamos a precisão nas buscas. Somos mais de 270 pessoas trabalhando de forma distribuída, inclusive nos nossos 5 hubs, todos conectados por essa missão e com muita sede de crescimento. O JUS Brasil é um dos maiores repositórios de informação jurídica do mundo. Disponibilizamos mais de 1 bilhão de itens de dados jurídicos, coletados em mais de 500 sistemas de tribunais, e recebemos mais de 28 milhões de visitantes únicos ao mês. E tudo isso porque nossa equipe acredita no poder dos dados e da informação. Contamos com um time incrível e, mais do que nunca, precisamos de ainda mais gente boa com a gente. Aqui, além de atrair gente boa, as desenvolvemos para que sejam ainda melhores. E levamos isso tão a sério que estamos patrocinando bolsas de pesquisa na área de computação. Queremos que a tecnologia do JUS Brasil permita que os brasileiros tenham fácil acesso à informação jurídica e a utilizem da melhor forma. Acreditamos que assim ajudamos a construir um ambiente seguro, seja para a busca por direitos ou para a tomada de decisões. Informação acessível significa transparência, e transparência significa confiança. JUS Brasil. Tecnologia, design, informação jurídica.
É tempo de somar. No mundo em busca por igualdade, nunca foi tão claro o valor das diferenças. Sabemos que as diferenças somam. O diferente soma para agregar, o ágil soma para entregar, o ousado soma para inovar, o excluído soma para fazer parte, o sonhador soma para construir. O futuro só existe no coletivo. E para garantir o futuro, é preciso somar no presente. É tempo de somar, de trocar o on pelo e. Há quase um século, do sonho de melhorar a vida dos brasileiros, criou-se a Lojas Americanas, que com o tempo somou novos negócios ao seu portfólio. Hoje, somamos mais uma vez. Lojas Americanas, mais B2W Digital, é igual a Americanas S.A. E o resultado dessa soma é muito mais que uma empresa de varejo. É uma plataforma de inovação tecnológica com infinitas possibilidades, que acelera o crescimento, nos torna mais ágeis e tem as pessoas no centro de tudo. Agora temos negócios ainda mais integrados, lojas físicas e digitais, e unidades de logística, inovação e fintech que multiplicam nossa capacidade de transformar a vida das pessoas. Somamos mais de 1.700 lojas físicas em todos os estados do país, com as 5 plataformas digitais que atendem 100% dos CEPs brasileiros. Agora temos uma base unificada de 90 milhões de clientes cadastrados, milhões de parceiros de negócios e um time de mais de 34 mil associados. Integramos nossas iniciativas socioambientais e ganhamos mais velocidade na busca por desenvolvimento contínuo. Somos um universo em expansão. Aqui, todas as pessoas são bem-vindas e cabe todo mundo. A partir de hoje, somos uma única empresa, Americanas S.A. Somamos o que o mundo tem de bom para melhorar a vida das pessoas.
Você trabalha com o quê?
Com tecnologia.
Onde?
Itaú.
No Itaú, em tecnologia?
É.
Ué, mas o Itaú é um banco.
E uma empresa de tecnologia.
O Itaú?
É. Itaú tem computação quântica, ciência de dados, inteligência artificial, informação na nuvem.
Pode trabalhar de bermuda?
Pode.
Você usa?
Não. O ar-condicionado é muito forte.
No Itaú, a tecnologia não é nada sem você e as pessoas que trabalham lá. Itaú, feito com você.
Isso é muito Itaú, né?
Isso foi em torno do fim de 2004. Para vocês só terem uma ideia, Bertie, na época, já era uma pessoa conhecida nessa área que se chama de Information Retrieval, que é a área de ciência da computação da qual sistemas de busca como a Google fazem parte. Claramente, isso era não apenas uma empresa interessante, mas um líder na empresa que tinha, obviamente, uma capacitação técnica que merecia a nossa atenção.
A gente chegou lá no escritório do Okuan e a gente teve a grata notícia, o Bertie só sentou e falou com a gente: olha, vocês estão demitidos da Okuan e segunda-feira vocês são funcionários do Google. Aí o mundo virou de cabeça para baixo. Né? Assim.
E a COA, então, se transformou na Google Brasil, o primeiro escritório de engenharia da Google na América Latina.
Todo mundo tinha abertura para poder compartilhar suas opiniões, e a gente, como um time, enfrentava essas dificuldades e essas questões de uma forma bem construtiva e interessante.
Então tinha uma cola muito forte lá. Eu acho que o Berthier tem uma importância fundamental nessa coesão. Eu acho que ficava muito claro que, apesar da escala ser diferente, do que a gente estava começando a fazer no Google, tinha eco lá atrás, né, do que a gente fazia na COA.
Hoje, o nosso escritório ele é muito reconhecido pela excelência técnica e pela qualidade das colaborações que a gente acaba construindo com outros times.
E eu acho que torna o grupo todo mais forte, no fim das contas.
Hoje eu paro e olho, eu vou chorar. Mas assim, nós fomos privilegiados de sermos escolhidos para participar do sonho do Berthier. A gente vai amadurecendo, esse sonho acaba virando nosso sonho também.
Eu tenho muito orgulho, né, do time de engenharia que a gente construiu, né? Esse é um time que tem uma reputação dentro da empresa. Nós temos uma reputação de ser um time de engenharia sólido.
Esse time do Brasil de engenharia é citado não por mim, mas por outros líderes de engenharia na Google mundialmente, como um dos escritórios da Google mais produtivos.
A gente tem aqui no Brasil uma história fantástica. Das 9 plataformas do Google, que cada uma delas tem mais de 1 bilhão de pessoas, o Brasil é um top 5 market em todas elas. Que a gente possa ajudar a continuar a ter impacto, a continuar a construir uma sociedade melhor, a construir um Brasil mais eficiente, mais inclusivo, menos desigual, e que as nossas plataformas sejam âncoras desse desenvolvimento.
Eu estou extremamente contente de poder fazer parte dessa celebração de 15 anos de tanto sucesso e desejando ao professor Berthier e ao nosso grupo da Google no Brasil ainda mais 15, 30, 100 anos de muito sucesso por aí.
Oh my God, you guys are gonna make me cry.
Chegou a hora dessa gente bronzeada mostrar seu valor. Eu fui à penha, fui pedir a padroeira para me ajudar. Salve o morro do Vintém.
Guardei a surpresa, obrigado.
Samba, 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 samba.
A missão da Log é conectar o Brasil, entregando tudo para todo mundo em qualquer lugar, sejam elas entregas locais ou nacionais. Mas como fazer milhões de entregas por dia num país tão grande e diverso como o Brasil? Com tecnologia. Tecnologia é a nossa essência, desde modelos preditivos que otimizam a rede logística, a operação de alta rotatividade e capacidade dos nossos cross-dockings. Tudo é orquestrado por software. Nosso sistema Single Pass mede pacotes com precisão para achar o lugar ideal de transporte. E ao combiná-lo com nossos algoritmos estocásticos, são criadas rotas finais de alta densidade com o mínimo de operação manual. Os pacotes são ensacados na nossa menor unidade de entrega. E as rotas finais podem ser traçadas por diversos modais de transporte. Nossa rede de malha logística aérea ou rodoviária transfere a carga no mesmo dia, por todo o Brasil, até chegarmos em um dos nossos muitos centros de distribuição regionais, a última perna da sua entrega. Dali, um entregador parceiro da nossa enorme frota, com a ajuda do aplicativo e de machine learning, chegará ao destino final. Log, conectando o Brasil.
Desenvolver, sinônimo de crescer, evoluir, tornar melhor. Melhor é a tradução de Melius. Somos uma empresa de tecnologia presente em 5 continentes e criamos soluções para todo mundo ganhar mais. Pessoas usuárias, lojas parceiras e o próprio Melius. Caso você pergunte como é trabalhar na nossa equipe fora da curva, é provável que alguém da nossa grande família te conte que por aqui acreditamos que nada é impossível e que valorizamos conexões que sejam de ganha, ganha, ganha. Estamos em busca de pessoas com espírito empreendedor, que entendem a importância do priorize e simplifique e acreditam que podemos conquistar clientes para a vida toda. A gente não para de desenvolver. Você vem?
Carinho. Tecnologia. Precisão. Tudo no seu devido lugar. Cada linha onde elas devem estar. Em outras palavras, perfeição. Para chegar a ela é preciso técnica, foco, prática e imperfeição. Errar, aprender, fazer de novo e criar o novo. E para isso só existe uma máquina. Não é essa. Nem essa. Nem essa. É essa. Uma máquina que todos os dias faz o possível e o impossível para ampliar suas possibilidades. Somos programadores, analistas, gerentes de projeto, engenheiros de software, estrategistas, especialistas, nerds perfeccionistas. A gente não brinca em serviço. Quer dizer, até brinca. O nosso negócio vai muito além de uma plataforma de monitoramento e segurança. A gente vende inteligência, estratégia, agilidade, rentabilidade. Estamos online aqui ou pessoalmente aí do seu lado, para fazer do mundo um lugar mais seguro, para sua empresa ser mais competitiva, para sua casa ser mais bem cuidada, para expandir as possibilidades. Nosso know-how é a tecnologia, o conhecimento, o envolvimento. Tudo para oferecer apenas uma coisa: a perfeição. Segware Security Performance.